Have you ever sat alone in your kitchen, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, and quietly wondered, when did everything start to feel so cold between you and your children? Not all at once. No, these things rarely do. It often begins with small moments that feel too subtle to name. A sigh when you offer advice, a glance at their phone while you're still speaking, the visits that grow fewer, the calls that go unanswered, or maybe it's the words cut sharp and fast, Mom, you're being too dramatic, or Dad, we've already talked about this, said with a tone that leaves you feeling like a child yourself. And then, without really meaning to, you start to question your worth in their lives. I want to speak to that part of you that still aches quietly, the part that wonders if maybe you did something wrong, if maybe, somehow. Love has an expiration date, and I want you to know this. It hasn't. It never does. But sometimes, respect the way it's shown can get lost in the noise of growing up, moving on, and forgetting where we came from. So many of us, as we grow older, find ourselves slipping into the background of our own families. We become the support beams no one notices, the safety net that's always expected to catch, the giver who gives long after anyone stops saying thank you. But being quiet doesn't mean being invisible, and being patient doesn't mean being walked over. What if I told you, you don't need to raise your voice, chase them down, or try to explain yourself endlessly to be heard? What if I told you that there is power in silence, not the silence of surrender, but the silence of self-respect? There's a story I once heard of a woman named Laura. She raised 3 children on her own after her husband passed unexpectedly. She gave everything she had: time, energy, savings to make sure her kids never felt the hole that loss left behind. And for years, they were close. She was their center, their rock. But as they grew older, that closeness began to fray. One child moved overseas and stopped visiting. Another only called when they needed help. The third often criticized her for being too needy when all she wanted was a conversation. Laura didn't yell. She didn't guilt them. But slowly, quietly, she started changing the way she showed up for herself. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. The first powerful thing she did, she stopped over-explaining her feelings. How often have you tried to explain why you're hurt, only to be told you're overreacting? How many times have you softened your voice, picked your words carefully, hoping that this time, they'll really listen? But when someone refuses to understand you, explaining becomes a way of begging. And you, dear friend, are not here to beg for decency. Laura began to simply name her feelings once, clearly, and without apology. If a comment stung, she didn't plead for understanding. She might say, "That hurt me," and leave it there. No further explanation, no emotional dance around their comfort. Her silence after that wasn't cold, it was calm, and it made them pause in ways her words never did. The second thing she did, she reclaimed her time. You see, when your children no longer treat you with kindness or respect, it's easy to keep giving in the hope that love will return if you just give enough. More money, more favors, more emotional labor. But giving from a place of fear doesn't restore connection. It deepens the imbalance. So Laura started putting time on her calendar for herself. Not just errands or chores, but joy. She joined a local painting group, took long walks without needing to rush home. She even started attending the community theater once a week, something she hadn't done since her 20s. And the beautiful part, she didn't announce it. She didn't make a point or try to prove anything. She just lived. And slowly, something interesting happened. Her kids noticed. They asked where she was. They commented that she seemed different, lighter, more distant, in a way that made them uneasy. Because something had shifted. She was no longer holding her breath, waiting for their approval. She had become her own center again. And maybe that's what I want most for you. To stop chasing respect and start embodying it. You don't need to argue your case. You don't need to remind them of all you've done or point out how much you're being ignored. You need only this: to return to yourself, quietly and without fanfare, in ways that make you feel whole again. That might look like not picking up the phone immediately when they call after ignoring you for days. It might mean not attending every family event where you're made to feel like furniture. It could mean gently declining a request that drains you, without guilt or justification. Because here's the truth, spoken softly: you have nothing to prove. You are already enough. And yes, it's okay to want closeness. It's okay to ache for the warmth that once was. But that ache doesn't mean you have to abandon yourself to get it. In fact, it's when you stop abandoning yourself that the most unexpected things begin to bloom, like respect, like curiosity, like the slow return of a child who begins to wonder where your light is coming from. Sometimes we don't even notice when it begins, that quiet pattern of putting ourselves second or third or last. When the children were young, you did it out of love, out of necessity, out of instinct. That's what good parents do, right? You stayed up through the night when they were sick. You made sure their shoes fit even if yours were falling apart. You smiled through your own sadness to give them peace. And back then, they needed that from you. But something subtle happens when those patterns don't stop, when they carry on, even as the children grow. And suddenly, you're still giving everything. But now, you're no longer thanked for it. You're expected to, and maybe part of you started to think, if I just keep being there, one day they'll see. One day they'll understand. But what if that day never comes? I want to tell you about someone named Brian. He was a father who prided himself on being dependable, solid, the one his adult daughters could always call at the last minute. And they did often, "Dad, can you watch the kids? Dad, my car broke down again. Can you come get me? Dad, we're tight on rent. Could you spot us this month?" And he always said yes. Not because he had nothing else to do, but because somewhere deep down, he feared what would happen if he said no. Would they pull away? Get angry? Would they stop calling? Then one day, Brian sat alone in his small apartment, his back aching from moving boxes for his daughter the day before. She hadn't said thank you. She hadn't asked how he was doing. She'd dropped a pizza on the table, said, "Here," and left to take a phone call. And for the first time in a long time, Brian felt something strange rising up inside him, not anger, but clarity. That's when he did something different. He started saying no, not loudly, not cruelly, but firmly. "No, I won't be able to come today. I need to rest. I'm not available this weekend." He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. At first, the pushback came fast. "What do you mean you can't? You've always helped us before. Are you okay? Dad, you sound different." But Brian just kept saying no when he meant no. And slowly, things began to shift. His daughters learned to respect his time, not because he scolded them into it, but because he modeled it. They began asking instead of assuming. And perhaps most importantly, they began to see him as a person again, not just a resource. This is the quiet shift I want you to feel in your own life. When you stop overextending yourself, you stop giving people the opportunity to take you for granted. You see, love is not the same as self-abandonment, and your worth is not defined by how useful you are to others. Sometimes, silence is not about shutting people out. It's about shutting down the part of you that thinks you have to prove yourself through exhaustion. There's a woman named Nicole I once spoke with. She spent years walking on eggshells around her son. Every time she tried to raise a concern about the way he spoke to her, he'd say she was too sensitive or just trying to guilt trip him. So she stopped speaking up. She tried harder to be easygoing. She'd even laugh off the things that hurt. But inside, she was folding in on herself. Then, something changed. One day, her son snapped at her in front of his wife and children. And for the first time, Nicole didn't smile. She didn't scold. She simply stood up, collected her purse, and said, "I'm going to head home. This doesn't feel good to me." Her voice was soft, her eyes calm, but her presence was unmistakably firm. And just like that, the energy in the room shifted. He called the next day not to apologize at first, but to ask what was wrong. She answered kindly, "Nothing is wrong. I've just decided to stop tolerating disrespect. I love you, but I won't stay in spaces where I feel small." It wasn't a threat. It was a truth. And that truth, spoken without anger, had more weight than all the arguments they'd ever had. Because the most powerful boundaries aren't the ones shouted in frustration. They're the ones lived with quiet consistency. When you respect yourself enough to walk away from hurtful patterns, you invite others to meet you at a higher standard or not at all. And either way, you win, because you are no longer sacrificing your peace for their comfort. And maybe that's the next gentle shift I want to offer you today. To begin replacing guilt with grace, when we start taking care of ourselves, not as a reaction, but as a lifestyle, we create room for dignity to return to the way we move through the world. You may not get an apology, you may not get a thank you, but you will get your self-worth back. and with it comes a quiet joy that needs no permission to exist. So when your children dismiss you, when they speak without kindness, or forget to see you as a whole person, try not to fight for their attention. Try not to beg for their love. Instead, stand still in the light of your own presence. Give less explanation. Take up more space. And watch what happens when you no longer bend to fit inside a version of yourself that no longer fits. Sometimes the most profound shift in a relationship doesn't happen when you tell someone how much they've hurt you. It happens when you stop waiting for them to notice. It's a strange sort of freedom, isn't it? The day you stop performing. The day you realize that no amount of patience, pleading, or proving will make someone see your worth if they've decided to forget it. But the moment you begin to treat yourself with the dignity you've been craving from others, something changes. Not always in them, but always in you. There's a quiet dignity that comes with living differently. Eric was in his early 70s when he finally retired from being Dad the Fixer. For decades, he was the one everyone leaned on: repairs, rides, babysitting, even bailing out his son from financial trouble more than once. And for a long time, that gave him purpose. But as the years passed, he noticed something unsettling. The more he gave, the less they respected him. He wasn't treated as a wise elder. He was treated as a backup plan. So Eric made a decision not out of bitterness, but out of deep, overdue clarity. He sold his house, downsized into a cozy apartment near the park, bought himself a telescope, and joined a local astronomy group. He started painting again, something he hadn't done since before he was married. He didn't make a dramatic announcement. He didn't send a speech to the family group chat. He just began to live his life. At first, they were confused. "Why didn't you tell us you were moving? Who's going to help with the car now?" "What do you mean? You're not free this weekend." But Eric stayed kind, calm, consistent. And over time, something unexpected happened. His children began to ask instead of assume. They started checking in. Not just about what he could do for them, but about how he was doing. Because Eric had stopped trying to be useful and started being whole. This is what I mean when I say you don't need to be loud to be heard. You only need to stand firmly in your light. When you stop living for their attention, their respect becomes less about obligation and more about recognition. And yes, sometimes they still forget. Sometimes they fall back into old habits. But the difference now, you don't fall with them. You stand steady. You smile softly. You keep living. There's a woman named Melissa who once told me that the greatest peace she ever felt came not when her children changed, but when she no longer needed them to. She started every morning with music, not the news. She took herself out for coffee every Friday at a little place by the river. She joined a community garden and grew the most vibrant tomatoes you've ever seen. And she did it all without waiting for company. One afternoon, her daughter dropped by unannounced. She was going through a tough time, work stress, kids acting up, feeling overwhelmed. And for the first time in years, she saw her mother not as someone to unload on, but as someone glowing with life. "You seem different," she said. Melissa just smiled. "I finally remembered who I was before I forgot." That kind of presence, it's magnetic, not because it demands anything, but because it radiates something rare, self-possession. You don't need to argue with your children about how they treat you. You don't need to beg for calls or explain your sadness or punish them with silence. You simply need to live. Live in a way that fills your cup before you try to pour into anyone else's. Live in a way that says, "I am still here. I am still worthy. I am still becoming." And slowly, quietly, those around you begin to respond, not because you've changed them, but because you've changed yourself. Let me be clear. This isn't about pretending you don't care. Of course you care. You love them. That love never dies. But you can love someone deeply and still not allow them to treat you poorly. You can hope for closeness and still protect your peace. You can show up with softness and still walk away with strength. That is not selfish. That is sacred. And here's the beautiful part. No one tells you. The more you love your own life, the more others want to be a part of it, not because you need them, but because your joy is contagious, because your peace feels like safety, because your presence is no longer filled with yearning, but with quiet, grounded joy. So if your children haven't called, if they speak without care, if they've forgotten all that you are, don't chase, don't shrink. Don't wait for them to notice your absence. Let them notice your presence. Let them wonder what has changed. Let them feel the shift in you not because you demanded it, but because you claimed it. Because the truth is, when you begin to respect yourself, the whole world starts to adjust, not always instantly, not always neatly, but undeniably. So take the walk, book the trip, paint the canvas, dance in your living room. Go where your spirit feels welcome. Laugh loud in places where your joy echoes. And if one day they come back not just out of habit, but with eyes that finally see you, let it be because they are drawn to your light, not your labor, because you, dear one, were never meant to disappear in the shadow of your love. You were meant to shine in the fullness of it. Thank you for staying with me. If you've made it this far, I want you to know something, truly know it. In the deepest part of your being, your presence matters, not because of what you give, not because of what you've sacrificed, but simply because you are here. You may not hear those words often, not anymore, maybe not ever in the way you hope to, but I'm saying them now. With sincerity and love, from one heart to another, you matter. The way you've shown up for others all your life, that hasn't gone unnoticed by the universe. The way you've loved, even when it hurt. The way you've remained kind, even when you were overlooked. The way you've kept hoping, even in silence. That quiet strength, it's not weakness, it's wisdom. And maybe that's what this whole journey has really been about. Not just about children and respect, but about you remembering your own sacred worth. Not because they finally saw it, but because you did. I don't know what your story is exactly. I don't know the shape of the pain or the particular words that still echo in your memory. But I imagine there are things you've held in your heart for years, maybe decades. Things you never said because you didn't want to cause trouble, or because you were told to just let it go. But today, I hope you give yourself permission to be honest with yourself. If with no one else, it's okay to feel hurt. It's okay to feel disappointed. It's okay to grieve the relationship you wish you had. But after the grief, I hope you choose to begin again. Not with them, but with you. Because there's still so much life ahead of you. Not as a parent, not as a role, not as a helper or a giver, or the one who holds everything together, but as a person, a whole, breathing, beautiful person, and you deserve a life that reflects that. If this video has touched you, even in some small way, I'd love to hear from you. Has your relationship with your children changed over time? Did something shift in you? What helped you through it? Or what are you still struggling with? You can share as much or as little as you like. There's no pressure here, only space. Space to be real, to be heard, to be seen. Your story matters, and I promise someone else reading it might find their own healing in your words. We're never as alone as we think. If you'd like to stay connected, I hope you'll click that little subscribe button. Not out of obligation, but because I believe we're building something here, a quiet community of people who have lived, who have endured, and who are still choosing hope, still choosing to grow. And if this message made you feel a little more understood, a little less invisible, then I'd be honored to continue walking alongside you, because you don't need fixing. You don't need to earn love. You don't need to prove your value. You only need to return to the beautiful truth that's always been within you. You are worthy, still, even now, especially now. So take a deep breath and let that settle in your heart. You're not behind. You're not too late. You're right on time to start living for you. And maybe, just maybe, that's the very thing that will bring them back. Not because you needed them, but because your light became something they couldn't ignore. So go ahead, light that candle, call that friend. Wear the outfit you love for no reason. Sit in the sun a little longer than usual. Speak kindly to yourself. Keep becoming the person you needed when you were younger. Because this chapter, it's yours, and it's going to be beautiful. Thank you again for listening, for feeling, for remembering your own strength. Until next time, take care of your heart. You've carried so much. Now it's time to carry yourself.